Well, one human shield has been replaced by another. I do find it morally repulsive that she resigned on a technicality basis, basically, rather than the actual injustice itself. Let's just be clear, this is one of the greatest scandals in this country in recent times. People who are as British as you or I, people who have lived here as long as you or I combined effectively have ourselves lived, who have been deprived of healthcare, who after having brain surgery have been thrown out on the streets and denied beds, who have been made homeless repeatedly and have been deported from this country. The idea that nobody was going to resign over that was clearly contemptuous. But let's be very, very clear about this. It was Theresa May as Home Secretary and then as Prime Minister who was responsible for the so-called hostile environment that led to this calamitous situation which has ruined so many lives in this country. And what we saw for many years, and it was most of the political elite, the Labour leadership excluded currently, as well as much of the left, lonely voices though we were, and the British media, who scapegoated immigrants for the lack of housing, the lack of secure jobs, falling wages and cuts to public services, which were the responsibility of the powerful, and it ended up in a situation where black Britons, people as British as you or I, have been kicked out of the country, denied healthcare and have been made homeless. Theresa May's responsible, she should resign, but the hostile environment has to stop. Otherwise, this injustice will happen over and over and over again, and we'll be debating human misery for many years to come.
Mark, let's pick up on that point from Owen, that all roads do lead to the Prime Minister, because she has earlier on admitted, confirmed that there were deportation targets while she was Home Secretary.
Indeed, and as far as I've seen today, the Labour Party also doesn't seem to be objecting to the idea that there ought to be deportation targets to deal with illegal immigration. What Owen just said, part of it is completely right. The Windrush scandal is an obscene scandal. It's appalling that anybody with legitimate right to be here was treated in this way. And it is horrendous. It is a serious failing, and it is right their head should roll for it. The second thing that Owen said, however, is completely wrong. I don't think you can just elide the idea of people who are legitimately in this country and illegal immigration. The fact is, most people, I think, watching today would say that, do we want people to be mistreated unfairly and wrongly as the Windrush migrants have been? Sorry, the Windrush generation have been. Of course they don't. Do they want a legal immigration challenge, which is a very different thing? Absolutely, and it should be possible for a government of any colour to fulfil both of those expectations.
And Owen, what the Prime Minister did say earlier was that they were responding to the need to deal with illegal immigration.
Well, I think we've got to the nub of it, actually. And this is about courage and it's about leadership. It's about being able to say things which at a given time are not popular. It was not popular in 2014 to oppose the immigration bill. Only a handful of MPs opposed it. That included the likes of Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell and David Lammy, for example, and Diane Abbott, who warned of what could happen as a consequence. And the government played to the basest prejudices that existed, whipped up by the tabloid press in this country. But actually, the British people are so much more decent than people have given them credit for. Because when they see the consequences of where this leads, where British citizens, as British as you or I, are deprived of their homes, are deprived of medical treatment, and are deported from this country, they see a grave injustice that cannot be justified. And that is why now, instead of a race to the bottom, which is what we've had for so many years, over scapegoating immigrants, which has led to this disastrous situation, we need now to be able to say to people, look, this is about fairness, a sense of fairness which most people in this country have, and by scapegoating immigrants, we have led to a calamitous situation that has caused this amount of misery. And maybe, just maybe, when we're talking about the lack of affordable homes, we should hold the government to account for not building them. When we're talking about public services under strain, many of them propped up by immigrants, by the way, maybe we should talk about the cuts to them. If we're talking about falling wages, because we had the worst falling wages of any industrialised country other than Greece, maybe we should hold those who plunge this country into economic crisis and politicians responsible rather than migrants. Because if we end up in a situation where we scapegoat immigrants for all the injustices and all the problems that we face in this country, we end up with this scandal. And that is a mirror everybody has to look at. And they might not like the reflection, but they need to look carefully because that's where we've ended up as a country.
Mark?
I'm sorry, Owen, but you've just done it yet again. What you've done is you've instantly started using this very broad brush term, immigrants, scapegoating immigrants in your terms, while you talk about abolishing the idea of any hostile environment policy, are you seriously saying, firstly, that there should be no distinction drawn between legitimate migrants and legitimate residents in this country and illegal immigrants? Are you seriously saying that we should not have a system that asks and checks whether people are legitimately in this country or not?
No, I'm not saying we should have a system to do with undocumented migrants. That's not what we're talking about with the hostile environment. We're talking about turning. We're talking about turning teachers and nurses and private landlords into unpaid border guards for the British state. We're talking about the introduction.
No,
let me just quickly. Let me give you a concrete example.
One at a time, please, gentlemen. One at a time, so we can all hear you.
Let me give you a concrete example now, and I want to test you on this because I think it's a fundamental point. We're now talking about the introduction of voter ID. This is modelled on the Republican right in America, which has tried to restrict the franchise, restrict the electorate to more affluent white voters who are more likely to vote.
It's modelled on the electoral system in Northern Ireland and the recommendations of the Electoral Commission.
Let me finish.
Well, no, if you're going to give an example,
voter ID, we know in both America and in this country, those least likely to have voter ID are people from black and minority ethnic communities. What will happen in practice as a consequence of this policy is voters from black and minority ethnic communities are disproportionately going to be turned away from polling stations to deal with an issue, voter fraud, which is minimal. I'm going to ask you now, Mark, because we may end up in a Sky News studio in a couple of years' time debating black and minority ethnic voters being turned away. Are you not scared of that eventuality, given 4 years ago, 5 years ago, me and you would have been in Sky News debating the immigration bill, and you would have accused me of scaremongering, and look where we've ended up. So that's a direct question. I want an answer to it.
Well, firstly, was that your answer to my direct question a moment ago about exactly why it is that you're proposing that we should have a system that does not ask about questions of legitimate migration or illegitimate migration? It's peculiar you've come back at me with that.
No. I've answered that.
You've asked Mark the question. Let him finish, please.
You asked me to wait while you gave your speech a moment ago. The second thing to say is that actually, personally, I've had some experience of dealing with the Home Office's mixture of incompetence and hostility when it comes to the rights of legitimate migrants. There are very serious problems in that system, and very serious problems, evidently, that need to be sorted out. It is a very serious issue. I don't think it's right to blur the distinctions between legitimate migrants and legitimate residents of this country and illegal immigration. The next thing to say is that when it comes to what you've just asserted about the idea of where voter ID and proper secure ballot in this country comes from, it simply isn't true. You ignore the fact that we already have this system in place in Northern Ireland. You ignore the fact that this is an official recommendation in order to improve the security of our ballot. And you also pursue this peculiar idea that as if voters of all different ethnic backgrounds are not capable of demonstrating very simple tests on their identification to have a fair ballot. What's peculiar about this is there are really, really serious issues about people's lives that we could be talking about right now. And instead of just deal with the practicalities and and I think reasonably in response to the point I just made, what you do is you jump off from one question of illegal migration, you jump onto a question of blurring the two. When I ask you about blurring the two, you jump onto the voter ballot. That's not a reasonable discussion.
If I could ask you, I mean, do you concede that there are legitimate concerns about illegal immigration? The term hostile environment was a phrase that was coined under a Labour government. In fact, the former Home Secretary, Alan Johnson, used the phrase on more than one occasion.
I reject New Labour, the old Labour establishment's way of dealing with immigration, which was a race to the bottom on who could scapegoat immigrants the most for the crimes of the powerful. And just to return to those 2 points by Mark, firstly, with voter ID, we know that the poorest in society are least likely to have ID. We know they are disproportionately likely to be from black and minority ethnic communities. And I would note a very, very striking irony here, that my opponent here is supposed to be an advocate for small state libertarianism, rolling back the state, would caricature me probably as a big state socialist who advocates turning teachers and nurses and private landlords into unpaid border guards for the British state. Yes, we do need to have a debate about undocumented migrants in this country without scapegoating or demonising them for problems caused by the powerful. That does not mean rolling forward the frontiers of the state in an authoritarian way, which has led to people who are British, as you and I are, being stripped of their medical care, being stripped of their house, and being kicked out of the country, which is a far graver injustice than anything that hostile environment was set up supposedly to deal with.
Okay, we are almost out of time. Mark, just a final thought from you.
Well, I think it's peculiar, and to be honest with you, I think less than honest and reasonable to go from to actually try and blur together three different groups, as Owen's just done. Firstly, people who are illegally in this country. Secondly, people who are legally and legitimately migrants to this country, and thirdly, black and minority ethnic Britons who have never migrated in their lives. These are different things, and I think, unfortunately, I don't think Owen's reasonably engaging with that topic.
Well, that's the point, though, isn't it? If you end up with a hostile environment for so-called illegal immigrants, the people who will be caught in the net include...
So you're suggesting there shouldn't be tests to require employers to prove that they are employing legitimate workers, for example.
Mark, the point I just made is...
Exploitative employers should not have to pass that test, in your view.
The reason I just said so-called illegal immigrants is because people who you and I agree with are not undocumented migrants, who are as British you and I are, have been caught up in the net, and that's the point I'm making.
Okay.
If you end up with a hostile environment for undocumented migrants in the way we've had, you will end up kicking out Britons from their own homes, stripping them of medical care, and kicking them out the country. And
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time. Gentlemen, I am afraid we're out of time. Owen Jones, Mark Wallace, very interesting talking to you. A debate that will continue for some time, I'm sure. Thank you.
We will make America great again.